Okay, well, we're now in studio number 3 for recording. A little bit different from the other ones, but here we go. And we're going to start off this one with what is trade. Now, we talk about trade. I want you to think first off back when you were like 8, 10 years old. And when you wanted something from your best friend, what did you do? You tried to get your best friend to take what you wanted them to have and get what you wanted from them. Trade. That's really all it is. So we're going to take a look at trade kind of like from the beginnings of modern trade. So for the Western world, that would be just as we're coming out of the Middle Ages. And then go to current and present, see what's going on. So the first thing I need you to do is I need you to get the basic trade note sheet. Right? That's one of those note sheets that were in the handouts prior to the class lecture. Remember, I want you to print out all of these as you go through. So, as we look at trade, all we're looking at is we're buying and selling goods and services. That's all trade is. Right? We're used to that. We go to Walmart. We can still go to Walmart, and we go ahead and exchange money for bread or stuff like that. So this is the concept of trade. And on the international scene, it's just countries trading. Right? It's still down to companies, but those companies come from different countries. Each country has a different set of rules, regulations, and laws that they have to follow when you do business in that country. So that's kind of the concept there. So why do we trade? Well, the 3 basic things are we obtain things. We want something. Okay, that person wants a rock, that person wants a stick. This person has a rock, that person has a stick. So we're just trading, that's all it is. The second is, specializing, right? We specialize. In other words, if we can do something that we do best and then can trade that for other things, we most efficiently use our own personal resources. Now, what do I mean by this specialization? Well, I'm doing it right now. I think I'm a much better teacher than I am a pro basketball player. So, I will earn more money teaching than if I was playing professional basketball. So I'm specializing my talents in teaching. So that's what I mean. I'm doing what I do best, I get paid for it, and then I can go and do other things. Now, part of this specialty falls into the place of if you had a brain tumor, would you want the teacher, the basketball player, or the brain doctor to actually go ahead and do the brain surgery? Well, I hope we're all smart enough to know, yes, we would want the brain doctor to do it, not these 2. So, while we may be good at stuff, the brain doctor is best at going ahead and taking care of the brain tumor. So, we take a look at this and we just go, yeah, that's what I would rather do. Why? Because each is specialized in what they do best. So that's kind of the key that we're looking at here. Now, the third and last part is that we have certain advantages of trading. Now in here we're kind of talking about advantages in certain things, advantages between countries, but we'll get to that. My example here is back in World War II when Germany was trying to defeat Britain in the air battle. Germany's main fighter was the Me-109 and the British main fighter was the Spitfire. Germany wasn't doing too well. And the head of the German Air Force, good old Hermann Goering, came and talked to one of his chief fighter pilots, who by the end of the war would be the head of the entire fighter pilot program in the German Air Force, Adolf Galland. And he said, when Goering was going, why can't we win? And Goering went ahead, Galland told Goering, well, just get me a couple of squadrons of Spitfires and we can go ahead and take care of it because they are a much better fighter plane than ours is. Advantages. Now, way back when, we started going ahead, and this is the development of trade. Right coming out of the, what do we want to say, the Dark Ages, we started in an age called mercantilism. This went from the 1500s to the 1700s. Mainly based in Europe. Government regulation of the economy. But governments and countries grew at the expense of other countries during this time. And wealth was measured in gold and silver. And they had two world superpowers as far as Europe was concerned back then. The first one, Spain. The second one, Portugal. Yeah, we kind of think, well, maybe France, maybe Britain. No, Spain and Portugal. Spain because it had a big army and a large fleet. Portugal because that's where navigators were trained to take all of the ships all around the world. And it was getting to a point where the Pope thought that Spain and Portugal were going to have a war. So what he did was he decided to divide the world between the two countries, called a line of demarcation. And what he did is he drew a line right down here. And he said everything on this side belongs to Spain, everything on this side belongs to Portugal. Remember, back then, they kind of thought the world still might be kind of flat. So they figured nobody's going to be able to go all the way around or all the way around, which later they found out they did. So anyway, that's why most of Brazil speaks Portuguese and the rest of South America speaks Spanish, as does just about all of our Latin American countries. So this went on for quite a while. And it did that up until, let me see, a guy by the name of, well, this is Sir Francis Drake here. And what was going on, remember we said that other countries got bigger and more powerful on the backs of others. Well, Spain and Portugal were the two superpowers, and good old England, yeah, our little spot up here, decided, and this was Queen Elizabeth at the time, I want some of this power in the world. So she created something that lives through today. She created what's called privateers. Now normally these only happen in times of war, but back then they could do whatever they wanted, whether it was war or not. What it was is the Queen gave our good old privateers here a little letter called a letter of marque. And it said you can go ahead and steal, plunder, and do whatever to the people on this piece of paper, and you are perfectly within your right to do that. And when Drake and the other privateers from England came back to England, half of the cargo of whatever they took from other people would go to the Queen's treasury, and the rest went to the captain and was divided up amongst the crew. Well, you can tell that in England, these folks were heroes. Of course, in Spain, we called them pirates, and they got hung if they were captured. So this went along, and Spain and England almost fought a few wars here and there, but it didn't really happen until 1776. And you go, oh, that must have something to do with the good old colonies. No, it didn't. It had nothing to do with the shot heard around the world. What it happened to do is with a guy by the name of Adam Smith. Because good old Adam here came up and told the king and queens that, you know what? It's not gold and silver that are the wealth of the nation. They don't get wealthy that way. That's just how they measure wealth. Well, you know, this has been going on for 200 years, and the kings and queens, they thought this was pretty good. But remember, rich people don't get rich by being stupid, so they said, okay, tell me more about this. So in this book, The Wealth of Nations, he went ahead and explained all of this. First off, every country specializes, right? If they specialize, they'll use the skills of their people to the best of their advantage. In other words, thing we like to call efficiency, okay? And then he came out and said, we need to freely trade. In other words, you don't have trade barriers and tariffs and taxes, that kind of stuff. We freely trade with our fellow countries because every country has advantages, and we want to go ahead and identify them first and make the most of those advantages. Okay? Now, the advantages sometimes talk about resources, and in this particular case, here's where we're going to start. Natural advantage. Every country has some kind of a national advantage over others. Well, what do I mean? Well, here's the question. Can we make bananas or grow bananas in Montana in the winter? Can we do that? Now, first question that I get from most of my classes, no, you can't do that. But the answer is yes. And everybody's going, no, that can't be right. Yes, it is. As long as we grow them in a greenhouse, we can go ahead and grow them in Montana in the winter. But it costs a whole lot of money to do that. Now, let's think about Nicaragua. Can we grow bananas in Nicaragua in the winter? Absolutely. Why? Because that's what winter looks like in Nicaragua. Okay? Nice trees, everything else, sun, bathing suits on the beach, and there we go. And because of that, it doesn't cost us a whole lot of money, right? Pennies on the dollar instead of dollars and dollars on top of dollars. There's the greenhouses. Here's just growing trees in the yard. So that's the first one of the advantages, a natural advantage. Now the second one that he brought up was acquired advantage. Now England, small country, didn't have a lot of natural resources, didn't have a lot of coal, but what they did is they started with this acquired advantage. Now this is where we focus into capital and labor. Okay? This is where the industrial age started. Building factories. Right? They were at start, some really small and really weird looking things, but they ended up being the engine that actually ran the world. There's an old saying of, at one point, the sun never set on the British Empire because it went all around the globe. Okay? But building factories, you also need trained workers to run those factories, and you needed the tools to make those factories. So we start looking at this, and the thing of it is it takes time to make these happen. This is what we mean by acquired. Over time, you acquire more factories, you acquire more trained workers, you acquire more and better tools to make all these work. So that's kind of where we're hitting this from. So as we look at that, we start thinking of, if I was able to get all of this stuff before another country, the other country's playing catch up. Which means, because I have all this, I'm going to start getting profit before, say, France. In the case of England, France was a competitor, Spain was the competitor, Holland was the competitor, the Netherlands. Right? We started going through this portion. And here's where, because England, that little itty-bitty island up in the middle of nowhere, became the empire the sun never set on. Because they had this advantage and they kept pushing it. As long as nobody overcame their advantage, they were number one. After World War II, that's what happened. We overcame their advantage. Going through World War II, we became one of the smaller economic empires, and all of a sudden we were the advanced country in the world. So the thing of it is the first country that gets better, faster, and cheaper than the other ones goes ahead and makes up all the profit. Right? Everybody else is playing catch up. So this is where we focus it through. So that's acquired advantage. Then, a little while later, this concept of absolute advantage came in. which basically meant that if I can absolutely do something better than you, so if my country, because I have all this machinery, can produce something better, faster, and cheaper than you, you shouldn't produce at all. What you should do is sell me your natural resources, and then I will convert them into a finished product and sell the finished product back to you. This is the start of transfer of wealth from the rest of the world to England. Okay? Now, after we threw the British out, they had to find someplace else to dump their convicts, because that's really one of the reasons that we had America. You know, you either went to jail in England or you were sent to America and you lived or died on your own over there. So when they couldn't dump them in the United States anymore, they dumped them in Australia. Now, the thing about it though is England did not want to go ahead and pay for all of the convicts over here in Australia. So what they did is they needed to create some kind of an industry in Australia that would go ahead and pay for everything the Crown needed Australia to do. And that's where, as they sent all of their bad folks to Australia, they came up with the concept of sheep. And that's why there's a lot of sheep farms in Australia. They're cheap, and it's not necessarily for their meat. What they want the sheep for is their wool. Right? That's a raw material in making clothes back then. So what would happen is England would send a little bit of money over here to buy the wool. And England would send, or Australia would send the wool back to England, who would turn them into socks and other clothes, which Australia would send them a whole lot of money for, and the clothes would come to Australia. Now notice, pennies, lots of pennies. This is what we call that transfer of wealth. Okay? The finished products are in Australia, but Australia provided the raw materials that England didn't have. This is also another reason why they had the colonial period. They needed their empires not to have huge armies or everything like that, but they needed the empires to provide raw materials for the factories in England. So here's where we get that massive transfer of wealth going from other countries to the mother country. Now, as we went through this, David Ricardo came up with this thing. He was going, you know what? Absolute advantage doesn't seem to quite fix the problem, until he came up with a concept called comparative advantage. And that's what we'll get into a little bit later. So right now, this is what your sheet should look like. And that's all for the basics. So next time we get back together, we're going to start talking about protectionism.